Every child who has ever stepped on a Lego brick barefoot at 2 in the morning has an origin story ready-made in their head, one they never had to be taught, one that arrived by osmosis through decades of packaging, commercials, museum exhibits, and corporate documentaries. Lego invented the brick. Lego invented the click. Lego invented the entire idea of building something interlocking, colorful, and infinitely reconfigurable out of plastic, one small piece snapping into the next, until an 8-year-old's imagination runs physically out of pieces before it runs out of ideas. It feels like one of those facts too obvious to even question. The kind of thing that doesn't register as a claim at all, just a description of reality. The same way you describe the sky as blue. Of course Lego invented the brick. What else exactly would a company named Lego have invented? Here is what actually happened. The brick that made Lego a household name, the exact stud-on-top, tube-underneath design sitting in millions of bins around the world right now, was not invented by Lego. It was invented by a British toy maker most people have never heard of, patented years before Lego touched plastic, and copied, almost feature for feature, by a small Danish carpentry workshop that was, at the time, in no position to be picky about where its ideas came from. The company that would go on to sue competitors for building bricks too similar to its own began its plastic empire by building bricks suspiciously similar to somebody else's. That's the reversal. Now here's how it happened. The story starts in 1916, in the small Danish town of Billund, population a few hundred people, where a 30-year-old carpenter named Ole Kirk Christiansen bought a small workshop and began building houses, furniture, ladders, and step stools for the surrounding farms. For over a decade, it was exactly what it looked like. An unremarkable regional carpentry business, the kind every small Danish town had one of, competing on price and reliability against a dozen shops just like it. Then came the 1930s, and with them, catastrophe stacked on catastrophe in a sequence that would have ended almost any other business. The Great Depression gutted demand for furniture families could no longer justify buying. In 1932, Christiansen's wife Kirstine died, leaving him a widower responsible for 4 sons and a company hemorrhaging money. That same year, with commissions for furniture nearly gone, he made his first pivot towards smaller, cheaper wooden items families might still spend a few coins on: step ladders, ironing boards, and eventually simple wooden toys. Then, in 1930, fire had already torn through the original workshop and destroyed it. He rebuilt on borrowed money. In 1942, fire struck a second time, burning the new workshop to the ground and destroying nearly everything he had rebuilt over the previous decade. Most businesses do not survive one such disaster, let alone a decade defined by 3 or 4 of them stacked on top of each other. Christiansen's survived largely by accident, because the direction he'd been forced into by the Depression, cheap wooden toys, turned out to be one of the only product categories that still moved during an economic collapse. A grown adult does not buy a new chair when money is tight. A parent, even a poor one, will often still find coins for something small that makes their child happy. Pull-along ducks, wooden trucks, yo-yos, building blocks, the plain wooden kind, no studs, no interlocking mechanism, just stackable rectangles a child could arrange and knock over. In 1934, Christiansen gave the reorganized company a new name, stitched together from the Danish phrase "læg godt," meaning play well. Lego. At the time, it was a name attached to a struggling regional wooden toy maker with a handful of employees in a town most Danes couldn't have located on a map, competing for the same shrinking pool of coins as every other small toy shop in the region. There was no brick. There was no plastic. Revenue was thin enough that Christiansen reportedly kept the company alive some years by also producing wooden farm and household items alongside the toys, whatever paid the bills that particular season. There was, in every meaningful sense, barely a company at all. This is the part of the story people are generally willing to accept, because it doesn't actually threaten anything about the myth. Sure, Lego used to make wooden toys before it made the brick. That's a fun fact. That's trivia night material. The kind of detail a company can even lean into as evidence of humble beginnings and hard-won reinvention. It doesn't change who gets credit for the thing that actually matters: the brick itself, the object every Lego story ultimately circles back to. The brick is still Lego's brick, born from Lego's own vision, shaped by Lego's own hands. Except it isn't. Not the shape, not the mechanism, not the core idea. To understand why, we have to leave Billund entirely and cross the North Sea, to a toy company operating out of Surrey, England, run by a man whose name has been almost completely erased from the story his own invention eventually made possible for someone else. His name was Hilary Fisher Page, and if there is a single person most responsible for the existence of the Lego brick, it is him, not Ole Kirk Christensen. Page was born in 1904 outside London, the son of a father in the lumber trade, and by his early 20s had already built a small side business, developing photographs for classmates at boarding school, a hint of the entrepreneurial instinct that would define his career. In 1932, with roughly £100 of starting capital, a genuinely small sum even by the standards of the time, he founded a company called Kiddicraft in Purley, Surrey. That's 2 full years before Lego even had its name. And Page started the same way Christensen did, with wooden toys, educational blocks and simple preschool playthings. But Page had a problem Christensen hadn't run into yet. He hated wood. Specifically, he hated painted wood, because the paint chipped, flaked, and got gnawed off by toddlers, something he considered a genuine safety and hygiene failure in a product meant for small children's mouths. So beginning in 1937, years ahead of most of the toy industry, Page started experimenting with an emerging material almost nobody was using for children's products yet: plastic. He wasn't just an early adopter dabbling with a new material out of curiosity. Toy historians describe him as a pioneer who treated plastic as a legitimate design medium in its own right, rather than simply molding it into shapes borrowed from wood. In 1939, Page filed his first patent, British Patent number 529580, for a toy building block, a hollow plastic cube with 4 studs on top that let one block sit securely on another without sliding off. It was a genuinely novel idea, an interlocking construction system made from injection molded plastic, at a moment when injection molding itself was still a young, expensive, faintly experimental manufacturing technology most toy makers weren't touching. Page kept refining the concept through the war years, and in 1947 he was granted a follow-up patent, number 587206, for a meaningfully improved version, a rectangular hollow brick carrying 2 staggered rows of 4 studs on top, engineered specifically so multiple bricks could interlock to build continuous walls, complete with the option to leave gaps for windows and doors. He named them Kiddicraft self-locking building bricks, and 2 more patents followed within a few years, one in 1949 covering side slits that let doors and window panels slot directly into the brick walls, another in 1952 covering a compatible base plate. This was not a niche product buried in an obscure industry catalogue somewhere. Page and his family built elaborate display models of houses using the bricks, and debuted them at London's Earl's Court Toy Fair in 1947, a major industry showcase. The sets sold. Today, the Victoria and Albert Museum of Childhood in London lists Page's self-locking building bricks among the defining, must-have toys of the entire decade, and the Brighton Toy and Model Museum still exhibits his original patent drawings. This was a real, patented, publicly launched, publicly celebrated British invention, roughly a decade ahead of anything Lego would produce in plastic. And in that same year, 1947, an ocean away, and by every account, functionally unaware of Page's existence, Ole Kirk Christensen made a decision that would connect their 2 companies forever. He purchased Denmark's first plastic injection molding machine at a price historians estimate consumed a substantial share of the company's annual profits, a serious, almost reckless financial gamble for a small regional toy maker operating on thin margins, based on little more than a hunch that plastic was where toys were heading next. Here is where the story stops being a coincidence. According to Lego's own official company history, the British firm that supplied that injection molding machine gave Christensen and his son Gottfried a sample of an interlocking plastic brick to examine, a brick that, by every available historical account, was either an actual Kiddicraft product or something built directly from Page's own patent drawings. Ole Kirk Christensen studied it. 2 years later, in 1949, Lego began producing its own version, calling it the automatic binding brick. It had the same rectangular body, the same 2 staggered rows of 4 studs on top, the same core mechanical logic for how one brick sat on another. Lego did not arrive at this design through years of internal research and material experimentation the way Page had. Lego looked at a brick someone else had already invented, already patented twice over, and already sold at a major London toy fair, and built its own close variant of it. There is a reason this fact does not appear on the packaging of a single Lego set ever produced, in over 7 decades of sets. Lego's own corporate history materials do acknowledge Kiddycraft as the origin of the design, but the acknowledgement is buried in language careful enough that most readers skim straight past it without registering what it actually says. The myth survives because almost nobody outside toy historians, patent attorneys, and a handful of obsessive collectors has ever had a reason to go looking for Hilary Page. But the paper trail is not subtle, and it is not disputed by Lego itself. The brick people call the Lego brick, arguably the single most recognized toy design shape in human history, began its life as somebody else's twice-patented invention on the other side of the North Sea. Now, it would be a mistake, and frankly a far less interesting story, to say Lego simply stole a design and rode it unchanged to global dominance. That is not what happened, and understanding what actually happened tells you far more about how Lego won than the copying alone ever could. Because Page's original brick had a serious, fundamental, physically measurable flaw, one that limited exactly how useful and exciting his invention could ever become. It didn't hold together very well. The studs on top of a Kiddycraft brick gripped the flat underside of the brick placed on top of it, but only through simple friction, a stud pressed against a smooth plastic surface with no internal structure reinforcing the connection. Toy engineers today have a term for how firmly two bricks resist coming apart: clutch power. Page's original design had almost none of it by modern standards. Stack a tower more than a handful of bricks high, and it wobbled visibly. Build anything with real architectural complexity, overhangs, connected wings, a roofline, and the whole structure risked collapsing under nothing more than a child's enthusiastic handling. Page had invented interlocking plastic construction as a concept. He had not invented a system stable enough to build seriously with. That single distinction is the entire second half of this story, and everything that made Lego into Lego hinges on it. The Christiansens spent nearly a decade trying to solve it, running through different material formulations as plastics technology itself rapidly evolved through the post-war years, adjusting wall thicknesses, tightening stud dimensions by fractions of a millimeter, all in pursuit of a grip that held without becoming so tight that a small child couldn't pull the pieces apart again. Through most of the early 1950s, the results were mixed at best, good enough to keep the automatic binding brick a solid, respectable, but entirely unremarkable regional Danish product. One toy among many, nowhere close to the singular cultural phenomenon it would eventually become. Gottfried Kurt Christiansen, who had by then taken on increasing responsibility for the company his father founded, treated the wobble problem as an engineering question worth solving properly, rather than papering over, reportedly obsessing over, the mechanics of exactly how and why the existing bricks failed under stress. It was Gottfried who eventually cracked the problem, and the solution he arrived at, filed for patent in 1958, is the actual, verifiable, unambiguous Lego invention, the one piece of this entire story nobody disputes and nobody needs to, the one piece of intellectual property that genuinely, uncontestedly originated inside the company. Rather than relying on a flat underside gripping studs through friction alone, Gottfried redesigned the underside of the brick with hollow cylindrical tubes, positioned in the gaps between studs, so that when one brick sat on another, the studs of the lower brick pressed directly against the inner walls of the tubes above, gripping from multiple points of contact instead of one flat plane. This is the stud and tube coupling system granted patent protection in 1958, and it is the single most important engineering decision in the entire history of the company, full stop. It gave the bricks what Lego still markets today, explicitly, by name, as clutch power, a specific, satisfying, audible click that let towers rise dramatically higher without wobbling, let structures survive being dropped, thrown, and stepped on, and let pieces snap apart cleanly when pulled instead of shearing, cracking, or leaving a stud behind. Where a Kiddycraft tower held together the way a stack of coins holds together, balance and hope, a Lego tower after 1958 held together the way a mechanical joint holds together, actual interlocking geometry doing actual physical work. This is not a small refinement, and it is worth being precise about the scale of the difference it made. This is the difference between a toy that technically functions and a toy an entire industry, and eventually an entire global culture, would organize itself around for the next 7 decades. Page's original design let you stack blocks. Gottfred's redesign let you build, genuinely build, with confidence that whatever a child's imagination produced would still be standing an hour later. The entire creative promise Lego is famous for today. The idea that you can construct literally anything you can picture and trust it to hold its shape exists because of that 1958 patent, not because of the 1947 one sitting underneath it as its unacknowledged foundation. There is a genuine irony sitting at the center of this that the company has spent decades quietly managing. Lego's founding myth, the one printed across company materials and repeated in documentaries and museum placards for generations, is a story about brilliant, singular, from-scratch invention. A Danish carpenter dreams up the brick that changes how the world plays. The real story is arguably more impressive and considerably messier. A company that copied someone else's flawed, promising idea wholesale, correctly diagnosed the exact physical reason it kept failing, and spent the better part of a decade obsessively, methodically engineering that specific failure out. Lego's genius was never the brick. Lego's genius was the tube. With the stud and tube system locked down by patent, Lego now had something Kiddicraft never managed to build in nearly 3 decades of trying. A version of the interlocking brick that was simultaneously mechanically superior and legally protected. A combination Page himself never achieved with his own invention. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Lego expanded rapidly across Europe, then internationally, positioning itself deliberately not merely as a toy company, but as an educational one, marketing the brick explicitly as a tool for creativity and cognitive development, rather than a passive plaything a child simply pushed around a floor. The company's own 1963 design rulebook laid out formal principles emphasizing unlimited play potential, compatibility across every set the company would ever produce, and durability strong enough to survive years of active play, and the pitch worked precisely as intended. Parents who might have hesitated over spending money on a simple stacking toy were considerably more willing to buy something explicitly billed as building a child's mind, rather than merely occupying their hands for an afternoon. The scale of what followed is difficult to overstate. Within a few decades, Lego sets could be found in a majority of European and North American households with young children, translated into dozens of languages, sold across a growing global retail footprint, all while maintaining a promise almost no toy company before it had managed. A brick purchased in 1962 would still click seamlessly into a brick purchased decades later, because the core stud and tube geometry, protected first by patent and later by the sheer inertia of an entrenched global standard, never meaningfully changed. Meanwhile, the man whose invention had started the entire chain of events quietly faded from view. Hilary Page's later years were difficult, and he died in 1957 at the age of 52, the same year Gottfred Christensen was finalizing the tube and stud redesign that would make Lego's version of his invention definitively, permanently superior to the original. Kiddicraft continued on afterward under different ownership, passing through a series of corporate acquisitions over the following decades, changing hands repeatedly, never once coming close to replicating what Lego built out of its foundational idea. In 1981, in a detail that closes the loop on this entire story with an almost uncomfortable finality, Lego purchased the rights to Kiddicraft's original brick patents and trademark directly from Hilary Page's own descendants. The company that built its empire on another man's design eventually bought that design outright, in full, ensuring no one else could ever legally stake a claim to the invention Lego had, by then, spent 3 decades and untold engineering hours building an empire on top of. The story surfaced publicly in the starkest, most ironic terms possible less than a decade later, in 1988 and 1989, when Lego found itself the plaintiff, not the defendant, in a landmark court case, Interlego versus Tyco Industries, against a rival manufacturer accused of copying Lego's own bricks too closely for a competing construction toy line. During that trial, Lego co-founder Gottfried Kirk Christiansen was cross-examined directly about the company's origins, and it was there, under oath, in a courtroom, that the plain assertion Lego had originally copied the Kiddicraft brick was formally put to the very man who had built the company from that copy. Lego won the case regardless, and decisively, because courts across multiple jurisdictions consistently found that the functional shape of an interlocking brick is the kind of thing patent law protects for a limited term, not something a company can claim forever the way a trademark or logo can, and by 1989, Lego's own original 1958 patents had already done their job, expired, and passed into the public domain along with everyone else's. The company that started its plastic era by building on top of somebody else's unprotected, expired-in-spirit idea spent the following 4 decades making absolutely certain nobody could ever legally do the same thing back to it. There is one more layer to the irony worth sitting with before we move on. Once Lego's own patents on the stud and tube system began approaching expiration decades later, the company did not simply accept the same fate it had once benefited from at Kiddicraft's expense. It fought, aggressively and repeatedly, to prevent other manufacturers from producing compatible bricks once the patent protection Lego relied on ran out, pursuing trademark claims over the visual appearance of the stud pattern itself in courts across multiple countries, arguing the brick's look, not merely its function, deserved protection. Most of these later cases failed for the same underlying legal reason Lego had once benefited from as a copier. Courts repeatedly ruled that a functional shape, however visually distinctive, belongs to patent law and its fixed time limits, not to permanent trademark protection. The company built on the ashes of somebody else's expired-in-spirit idea spent the next half-century trying, with limited success, to make sure history never repeated itself against it. By the final decades of the 20th century, Lego was not simply a toy company anymore. It had become one of the most recognized manufacturing brands on the planet, reporting billions in annual revenue, expanding into licensed franchise sets built around Star Wars, and countless other properties, video games, dedicated theme parks across multiple continents, and eventually feature films that would themselves become billion-dollar franchises. All of it, every set, every theme park, every film, sits on top of a brick shape whose basic proportions, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, are still recognizably, unmistakably Hillary Page's. The studs, the rectangular body, the staggered stacking logic for building walls with gaps left for windows and doors. All of it traces directly back to a British inventor's 1939 and 1947 patent drawings, filed by a man almost nobody watching a Lego commercial, opening a Lego set, or walking through a Lego store has ever heard of. Step back from Lego specifically, and a pattern starts to emerge that shows up again and again across the history of the products people consider most iconic, one that should fundamentally change how you think about where invention actually comes from and who deserves credit for it. The company, or the person who becomes permanently synonymous with an idea, is very rarely the one who had the idea first. It is instead almost always whoever took a flawed, promising, publicly available but underdeveloped version of that idea and did the slow, unglamorous, patient work of fixing exactly what was broken about it. Hillary Page saw the future of children's toys before almost anyone else working in his industry. He was right about plastic as a serious design medium years before his competitors took it seriously. He was right about interlocking construction as the future of building toys. He was right that painted wood, the material every toy maker before him had defaulted to, was a genuine dead end for both durability and child safety. He got the underlying vision correct in nearly every respect that mattered, filed the patents to prove it, and put working products on shelves at a major toy fair to demonstrate it. And he still isn't the name printed on the box sitting in your closet right now. What he lacked wasn't insight. It wasn't ambition, and it wasn't even priority, since his patents predate Lego's plastic bricks by roughly a decade. What he lacked was one specific, narrow, solvable engineering fix, a tube instead of a flat surface, that would have made his own version work as well as it needed to in order to become what Lego eventually became. Someone else found that fix, on the other side of a sea, using his own patented invention as the explicit, acknowledged starting point, and history quietly handed them the credit for the entire idea, tube and brick alike. This is not, in the end, simply a story about theft rewarded, though there is a version of it that could be told that way, and a British courtroom in 1989 briefly forced that version into the open. It's a more useful story about where real, durable, generational value actually gets created in any industry. It is rarely located in the initial spark of an idea, which turns out to be more common, more repeatable, and less rare than people instinctively want to believe. It is located instead in the unglamorous second act nobody puts in the highlight reel or the museum placard, identifying with total precision why a promising, already invented idea keeps failing in the real world, and then doing the exact, specific, often invisible work required to make it stop failing. Ole Kirk Christensen did not dream up the interlocking plastic brick sitting in his son's hands in 1947. His son Gottfried figured out, over years of trial and error, exactly why the interlocking brick nobody fully trusted needed a hollow tube on the bottom instead of a flat plane. That single tube is worth, by any reasonable estimate, tens of billions of dollars today, sustaining one of the largest toy companies on Earth. The brick that gave the entire idea to the world for free, patented, publicly documented, sitting in a British toy museum right now, is a footnote most people will never read. So the next time you step on a Lego brick in the dark at 2 in the morning and curse the name of whoever invented this particular form of household warfare, you're not actually cursing Lego, and you're certainly not cursing Ole Kirk Christensen, the carpenter who rebuilt his workshop twice after 2 separate fires. You're cursing the ghost of a man named Hilary Fisher Page, who saw the shape of the future a decade early, built it, patented it, and watched a small, struggling Danish carpentry shop take that shape, fix the one thing wrong with it, and become one of the most powerful brands in the history of the toy industry, while his own name faded into a footnote in the very museum built to remember him.